Hey everyone, so as I promised, this is the next CPD, and it's as was scheduled, so it was always due on the calendar to be about memory, revisited. We've had 2 previous sessions about memory and how our memories work before now, and I've kind of stuck with that schedule, albeit done in a different way. A few points during the session I'll refer to the Teaching Walkthroughs book, and you'll have seen from the email I sent round at the start of the week that we've got a copy of this for all staff. Now, next year it will probably be more prominent, and you'll probably find that it's a real reference point in the whole staff CPD. It's excellent, but I have already kind of stolen a couple of ideas from it that I've incorporated into today's CPD. So that's what I'm referring to when I talk about the walkthroughs, and you'll see what I mean when you pick up your copy of the book when you're next in school on the rota. So one of the first ideas that I have sort of stolen from that book is this idea of elaborate interrogation, and I've heard quite a bit about this, but I've never thought about doing it this way before. So in the past, I've always thought that elaborate interrogation was about the teacher's questioning technique, the questions that they ask, making sure they're asking questions which challenge the student's understanding and not just their recall of knowledge. But in the Walkthroughs book, they suggest a way of using it as a retrieval task. So this is what I'm going to suggest you might have a go at doing today as your retrieval task. If you wanted to do it in a class, you could do it as a paired activity when you thought your students were ready, and then obviously it wouldn't be a silent retrieval task, it would just be something you incorporated into your lesson. But if you do it on an individual level and you ask them to design their own questions first of all, then it can be done in those silent conditions and as a sort of proper true retrieval. You'd have to be confident that the students were secure in their knowledge, because this is one of those tasks that's getting them to think about making connections, strengthening the schema, and it's really testing understanding, and we know that you've got to have the secure knowledge before you can do that. But anyway, have a go. This would be the task. You would ask the students, or in this case I'm asking you, to create as many different questions as you can which allow you to explore and really test that knowledge, and I've said of cognitive science. So anything we've done up to this point about memory and cognitive load and all of that, I would just ask you to design as many interrogative questions to yourself that you could. Now, I'd provide a little bit of scaffolding. So here we might suggest question stems and get the students, or in this case, get you thinking about those questions which are really going to interrogate your understanding of this world of cognitive science and memory and get you to make those connections. So questions that begin with how does, why did, what happens if, or what happens next, to what extent, are going to really interrogate your understanding of it. So if you choose to, you could take a few minutes now and you could come up with a series of questions. So remember, you're focusing on cognitive science, memory, and all of the work that we've done around that, and try and use those question stems. Hopefully you had a go, you came up with a few. Here's a few I did earlier. Some examples. So you might have come up with questions like, how might dual coding reduce the problem of cognitive load? Why did Ebbinghaus conclude that the best strategy to use is retrieval and practice testing? What happens if the student experiences cognitive overload? To what extent is it true to say that the human memory has limited capacity? Now, to come up with those questions would allow you as the teacher to see and to assess a certain level of understanding, but for them to then have to answer those or possibly explain the answers to a partner, and you listening in on that, would also really allow you to see that their level of understanding. And them having to do it and having to retrieve it from memory is in itself strengthening that schema and strengthening it, because what these types of questions do is they force you to make connections. You wouldn't be able to answer how might dual coding reduce the problem of cognitive load if you weren't making a connection between, well, what is dual coding and what is the problem of cognitive load and how does dual coding work, and therefore why does it help to reduce that problem? You're really having to form connections and make links. And so I think that's a really powerful little technique to use. In the Walkthroughs book, it steps you through it. exactly how you might do that in a classroom. And obviously it would take a little bit of preparation, and your students would need a little bit of pre-preparing, I guess, on what we mean by interrogating questions. And you might need to provide them with the stems, like I did. You might also need to provide them with extra scaffolding. And I've just posed this as a question here: what other scaffolds might you provide? So I might have given you or referred to you this sheet that you've had in the past, which has got lots of information on it. I might feel that for some students, they're not quite there yet in terms of being able to retrieve all of that. So I'm going to give them that scaffold, I'm going to give them that prompt, and they have to then identify their interrogating questions. They're still having to think, and they're still having to retrieve knowledge when they're then recounting that to their partner. But we just need to ask ourselves that question all the time, and I'll come back to it a bit later in the session. What scaffolds might we need to provide for who, and who won't need them, and how are we going to gradually remove them? So I kind of touch on scaffolding a bit in this session as well. So we remind everybody again of the big picture. Now, obviously today we're thinking about memory, so we're mainly focused around this idea of retrieval, but it links to explanation as well. But I think this idea of showing the big picture is important, because we're talking about memory, and we know that to have really secure knowledge and be able to remember it, we need strong schema. And the way we get strong schema is to be able to understand the links and connections. And so by continually coming back to the bigger picture, that helps students do that. And we can kind of almost zoom in and zoom out. And if we think about how we might do this in the classroom, that bigger picture could be a knowledge organizer. It could be a visual. It could be a summary of lots of different things that have to have been achieved, and you're just zooming in. It could be a timeline. It could be a montage of lots of different scenes from a play. But you're zooming in on particular bits, but you're then zooming back out and allowing the students to see where the connections are. And you're going to see throughout this session that this idea of schema and memory, it's so important, that link that we need to make. So this next, there's a video clip, and it is 5 minutes, but it's funny. So I just think take 5 minutes and just watch it. I've again stolen this idea of using telling the time to demonstrate something. Claire Seeley did a fantastic presentation. I know some of you saw it from the Research Ed Durrington event, which went online this year, obviously, and they shared some of the a lot of the presentations online. And Claire Seeley did a brilliant one about cognitive load, and she used the example of a Fibonacci clock and stepped us through it that way. But this idea of cognitive overload and telling the time, I think, is quite a nice example, and it's one that's quite pertinent to me at the moment, because I'm trying to teach my daughter to tell the time, and until I started that process, I did not think about just how complex it is. So watch this video clip to start with, and then we'll kind of we'll run with this telling the time example. When it's ready, my internet is obviously not that fast.
So one of the most important things we as parents do is we teach our children about time. We teach them important things like reading the clock. You actually think that's important? I'm going to teach you to read the clock. Teach you to read the time. Why? Because it's important that you know the time. Why? Because how would you know when to get up to go to school? Mummy would make me. What if Mummy wasn't there? You'd wake me. What if we both weren't there when we go to school? How would you know when breakfast was? I'd be hungry. Shut up! Somebody came along to you and said, "What time is it?" and you didn't know, you'd feel stupid. Why doesn't he feel stupid? He doesn't know. Let me go through this whole thing. I did it myself, my son. Teach you how to read the clock. This is a clock. It's not actually a clock. It is a clock, but it's not a clock. It's a watch. It's called a watch. It's a wristwatch because it's on my wrist. Yes, it's a wristwatch because it's on my wrist and I watch it. Yes, very good. Now, there's time is made up of zones, periods of time, all right? There's hours, minute, no, not hours. No, they're not hours. They're hours. They don't belong to us. It's a different spelling. Hours. Not howards. It's silent. I don't know. Now, on every day, there are 24 hours. 24 of these hours. 12 in the day and 12 in the night. I know I said there are 24 hours in the day. 12 in the day, 12 in the night. But a day is made up of a day and a night. What are you, stupid? I couldn't very well say Monday night. Everybody knows when I say Monday, I'm talking about the 24 hours. Now shut up and listen. Now, on every clock or watch, there are 3 pointers. They're called hands, all right? They point to the hour, all right? Understand that? There's the hour hand. That's the first hand, the hour hand. The second hand is the minute hand, and the third hand is the second. Shut up! We'll do away. Forget about the third hand. Forget it. It's gone, all right? It's gone. Now we have 2 hands. On the face of the clock, there are 2 hands, all right? There's the hour hand, which is the fat hand, and there's the thin hand, which is the minute hand. So you have a fat hand and a thin hand, all right? Fat hand, hours, thin hand, minutes. Right. Now, up the top of the clock, you see the number up there, 1 and 2. 1 and 2 is 12. It's not 3. It would be 3 if you joined them together. We already have a 3 here on the side by itself. We don't need 2 bloody 3s on a clock. So it's 12. All right? 1 and 2 is 12. So when the fat hand and the thin hand are pointing at the 1 and the 2, it is 12 o'clock in the daytime. Because it would be dark and you wouldn't be able to see it. Now the thin hand starts to move away from the fat hand. It likes the fat hand. Yes, it likes the fat hand, but if it wants to tell the time, it has to go away from the fat hand. So it moves away from the fat hand, leaving the fat hand at the 1 and the 2, and then it comes over to the 1 here by itself. See the 1 to the right of the 1 and the 2? Now, that 1 is 5. Because it is, it's 5. 2 is 10, 3 is 15, 4 is 20, 5 is 25, 6 is a half. Half. Because 12 is the whole, so 6 is the half. 7 is 25 2 or 35 past.
Okay, so it does go on a little bit, but you get the idea. And so really, when we come back to this idea of telling the time, I really hope that's not the view that my daughter has of my explanation. But regardless, when you think about it, telling the time that we take for granted is a really complex series of steps. And of course, if you tried to teach a child or anybody to tell the time straight off everything all at once, they would have total cognitive overload. And that was kind of the point that Claire Seeley was making in her excellent presentation that I referred to. So if we want to think about how to support a student to achieve that end learning goal, whatever that end learning goal might be, and in this case, it's being able to tell the time both digitally and analog, then we need to identify all of the steps that are going to allow them to get there, that they have to be really secure in before they're anywhere close or anywhere ready. So actually, if you take it right down to a young child who might be embarking on this journey, they have to be able to recognise all the numbers between 1 and 12 for analog, but all the way up to 59 if they're looking at a digital clock. So can they recognise the numbers? Do they know what a 6 looks like? And unless they're really secure in that, there is no point ploughing on. And then there's all of those other things, isn't there? They've got to understand the role of the two hands, which one's the minutes and which one's the hours. They actually have to be able to count up in fives if you're going to teach them that it's 5 past, 10 past, quarter past. So essentially, they need the basics of the 5 times tables. And that's going to take a lot of work to get them secure in that before they can even begin to understand what on earth is going on a clock face. And then you bring in the concept of essentially fractions. You know, we've got a whole, and then we've got a half, and we've got a quarter. And all of this is actually a massive, massive job. And I've referred to it here that they have to be secure in their knowledge. So you have to pace it right. You can't jump straight down here or speed through these without lots of practice and lots of rehearsal. And some students will need more scaffolding than others. So it comes back to that idea of scaffolding. And of course, alongside all of this, if we use that term that Christine Council uses that I've talked about before, the hinterland, we might talk about how the earliest people told the time before clocks, and we might talk about where the idea of AM and PM comes from, and we might show lots of different examples of clocks and watches, and we might do lots of contextual stuff like, well, what might happen at 12 o'clock and what time might we go to bed? Actually, there's this whole world of hinterland that we'd probably be exploring alongside this, or at least signposting, so that we get to a point where we reach our ultimate end goal of being able to tell the time, but we have an understanding of what that actually means. A concept of time, I guess. Well, that's not easy to achieve. But you can see this importance, and I think this shows a couple of things. It shows the importance of scaffolding, of course, and of breaking things down into manageable steps and into being really secure in your knowledge before you can move on to the next step. But it also shows just how important it is to reduce our cognitive load by taking things step by step, but also allowing us to see the connections between them. So it's this schema again. What's the connection between the big hand being on the 6, this concept of a half, and then 6 being half of 12? Like, how do all of these things connect? And then how does the 30 minutes connect to the fact that there's 60 minutes in an hour, so it's half an hour? There's so much. And until our scheme is secure, and we're building all the time, strengthening these connections. What was a half again? How many minutes were there in an hour again? Until we get there, you're never going to be able to achieve your end goal, and it would just be overwhelming to try and do it all in one. So, I mentioned a few times this idea of scaffolding. And actually, again, this is something that was prompted by looking at something in the walkthroughs book where they talk quite a bit about scaffolding. They didn't suggest doing it as a continuum, but to me, this was just something I thought would be quite useful. I think you need to think about your classes obviously, but have one in mind in terms of a continuum, where your continuum goes from no scaffolding at all, there might be 1 or 2 students or several students who fall in that category, up to maximum scaffolding. And I think you as the teacher, I'm not saying you write this out, but you need to have it clear in your head. You as the teacher need to have an awareness when you're introducing a new topic or you're doing a new piece of learning, where on the continuum each of your students is likely to be. And therefore, thinking about the possible scaffolding strategies, who's likely to need which ones, and gradually how am I going to be removing them and nudging them down to the bottom of that continuum. And they'll all do that at a different pace. So viewing it as a continuum, I think, is quite useful. And I ran with this telling the time example, and I put some of this possible scaffolds. So I might give some students or a child a timetable line, like showing how we count up in fives and jump from 5 to 10 to 15. I might, to help with this concept of the halves and the quarters, have a picture of a cake divided up. I might give clock faces and next to them have digital times. So I might give a few worked examples. I might plot the hour hand in and just get them to refer to 1/4 past, 1/2 past, so they're just rehearsing one particular bit before they can move on to connect two different bits. And I might give a picture to contextualize the clue, so a picture of lunch to help them understand this concept of 12 p.m, whatever. Now, obviously, as the expert, and I'm no expert in teaching somebody to tell the time, but as the expert in your subject, when you've identified the different scaffolds, you would know where they sit on the continuum, which one is a higher degree of scaffolding than the other. You know, if we apply it to a different example, a structure strip, where does that sit alongside a, sentence starters? So you know the degree of scaffolding that, and how that's gradually stepped up or down for your subject and in your context. But I do think the continuum idea is quite a useful one. So I've used this before, this quote by Eysenck, and it's this idea of, and I keep using the term schema, it's the idea of a framework or a structure that we can use to organise our learning, and then our retrieval from memory is considerably improved. And we're trying to think about things we can do in the classroom and across time that will improve and strengthen our students' schema, essentially that framework, so then their retrieval is improved as well. The knowledge is stronger. And if we think about a really simple strategy, it's that zooming in and zooming out that I talked about before. So it's when we're introducing a piece of learning, and I'm going to try this, and I hadn't done it live. I should have practiced, shouldn't I? Go back. In PowerPoint, when you're in the presenter view like this, you can actually just choose to zoom in and you can pick on the particular bit. So if I decided, okay, we're really focusing on retrieval and zooming into that, you'd have to play around a bit and make it a bit more sophisticated than that. And then we're zooming back out again. And essentially that is going to, there we go.